Welcome to another episode of the Locked On Hawkeyes, the latest addition to the Locked On Sports Network's growing lineup of college podcasts. I am your host, Andrew Wade, editor over at DearOldGold.com, where you can find all of your analysis pieces on all things black and yellow, and we have a fantastic episode ready for you today. As you all probably know, Iowa plays Nebraska on Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, and what is the Big Ten's trying to rev this up to be a real rivalry, but in the last couple of years, it hasn't really mattered as Nebraska has kind of struggled to make this much of a meaningful game. However, this year could be different, and we do have a rival expert jumping on the podcast today to talk to us about the Nebraska Cornhuskers and what they bring to the table and what we as Iowa fans should be concerned about when playing the Nebraska Cornhuskers, who are currently 4-7 and have 4 games won over the last 5 games. So they kind of are doing pretty well. The only loss there was to Ohio State. But like I said, we have a great episode to cover all of that today and get you ready for Friday's great game that should end in an Iowa win, as we all hope and expect. If you didn't get an opportunity to, though, make sure to check out our previous episode this week where we covered kind of a recap of the men's basketball's performance over the last couple games. If you didn't see the news now, they are ranked 20th in the nation, which is fantastic for a team coming off of a 14-win season. And the football team obviously beat Illinois this week. So we covered that, talked about the dominating performance of AJ Epineza and what that means for the Hawkeye program going forward. And then we also touched on the Big Ten slate of games and kind of what happened over the course of the Big Ten. So definitely some good content you do not want to miss on yesterday's episode. As I said, for today's episode, we're going to be skipping some of the general segments that we cover, right? So each episode, we typically do 3 different unique segments covering different pieces of Iowa Hawkeye athletics. But today, our episode is entirely devoted to Iowa versus Nebraska. It is a rivalry game in the sense that it's a deemed rivalry game by the Big Ten. It's called the Heroes game, but for me personally, a rivalry game needs to actually have some bad blood between the two. And I really don't feel like there's been a ton of bad blood over the last couple of years, as Iowa has dominated Nebraska pretty handily over the last couple of years. And I'm definitely touching on this quite a bit. I want to get our guest kind of riled up before we jump into the game. We do have Ryan Thielen joining. He is my co-host over on the Big Ten Sports Podcast and one of my best friends, and also a guy who knows a ton about Nebraska Cornhusker football, and to make him feel a little uncomfortable, one of the smartest sports people I know. So I'm happy to have him on the podcast. Ryan, how are you doing today, buddy?
I'm good, man. Thanks for having me over here. I agree with you on the rivalry piece. And when Nebraska came over to the Big Ten, they tried to build it up as the new rivalry because Nebraska lost, the rivalries they had with Oklahoma and Colorado, but it just kind of hasn't felt that way. As you said, Iowa's won the last 3 games, and most of them haven't been very close. But I do have to slip it in. All-time series, Nebraska leads 29-16. So still got some catching up to do over there in Iowa.
Yeah, I have some thoughts on that. I do feel good knowing that you don't think this is a rivalry game either. I feel like it's really forced. I feel like it makes sense. They're cross I-80 rivals. They're only 4 hours away. They're, I would say, not similar programs in the sense of a historical purpose, but they typically rely on similar types of recruiting mechanisms, getting those farm boys from Nebraska and Iowa, building them up into dominating linemen, that kind of thing. And so I think there are a lot of similarities that you can take from both programs, and it makes sense to eventually be a rivalry, but you can't just slap a name on a game, put a trophy in it, and expect the teams to hate each other. Although I do feel like Iowa people in general like to make fun of Nebraska because it's kind of like the kid who gets bullied in the playground, and then they find the weakest kid in the playground and they try to bully on him. And I feel like that's Iowa and Nebraska. Because let's be honest, neither state really has a ton going for it.
No, you're right. And I'd say Nebraska tries to do the same thing to Iowa. So yeah, that's 100% true. I think everybody goes with the N stands for knowledge, and Iowa is just idiots out wandering around or whatever that is. And it's like a natural rivalry that, like you said, people are trying to force. And I think maybe once they start getting some competitive games, it'll get there. And I think maybe that starts this year, just with the way Iowa's ending the season and Nebraska's kind of picking it up at the end of their season as well.
I 100% agree. And before we jump into that, I just want to make sure the listeners know you can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast at. Please leave us a review, subscribe and download, all that stuff. And feel free to interact with us on Twitter at Locked On Iowa. And you can interact with myself at Wade_Andrew. So if you have questions, comments on the podcast, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. Love to get some content feedback, that sort of thing. And love to just hear from fans of the show. So if you have an opportunity, please subscribe to our podcast and you'll be getting every episode downloaded automatically as we post them. We usually do about 4 to 5 episodes a week. So thank you for doing that. Jumping back to kind of the historical piece, you did mention that Iowa is losing the historical series to Nebraska. I do think in the upcoming years, Iowa, it could be a very good rivalry. Like you said, it seems forced. It definitely makes sense. It's a natural rivalry in the sense, but with the last 5 games, Iowa has won 4 of them, and they've won by some pretty big margins. I believe in 2 of the seasons, Nebraska was actually ranked at some point, and Iowa beat them by over 20 points both times. So it's been an interesting kind of series so far. Since Nebraska's come over, Iowa hasn't had a really fantastic season outside of the 2015 season. Meanwhile, Nebraska, in my opinion, has been somewhat hyped up most seasons, and they start out the gate pretty strong, and they struggle down the stretch, and then they play Iowa, and Iowa doesn't have a ton to play for usually at that point, and they just beat down Nebraska. It's almost as if Nebraska says, screw it, we're done with the season, and that very well could have been a coaching type thing or a culture type of thing. So interested to get your opinion on that. But with Scott Frost kind of jumping into the Nebraska program, obviously a Nebraska legend from the early 90s or the mid 90s, I believe, bringing in a new sense of culture. And obviously Nebraska kind of struggled out the gate. But I do believe there's a chance over the next 5 to 10 years that this rivalry becomes an actual rivalry, right? It's not just going to be a trophy game. It's going to be something that these players hate each other. They love to play each other and they love to beat up each other. And it hopefully going to be battles between ranked teams going forward. Kind of interesting swing of things going on, but kind of wanted to get your thoughts on the culture that Scott Frost brings to Nebraska and what that means for this series going forward.
Sure. And you touched on some good points there. I think, previous seasons under, Coach Mike Riley, Nebraska started the season 0-6. There's not any chance in the world they would have won 4 of their next 5. If you've listened to what Scott Frost has said, he mentioned, during the Purdue game, which was their 4th game of the season, then they ended up losing that one by 2 touchdowns at home. He really saw that game as the turning point from a cultural standpoint, in the sense that, the seniors got together with him. They started having conversations, really figuring out what they needed to do to turn things around and right the ship. Next week, you saw some of that against Wisconsin. The week after that, they should have beat Northwestern. And now they're at the point where, they're not saying we should have won that game. They are winning games. And Scott Frost has preached culture since he got back to Nebraska. I think that's clear that the culture is changing, right? I mean, the strength of mind that they had going into going against Michigan State last week at home, being down 6 points, coming back and winning that 9-6 in the fourth quarter in terrible conditions when, statistically they didn't play very well, and just figuring out a way to win. They've been an offensive team all year. Last week they won a game 9-6 against, a solid Michigan State football team.
Let's hold on though. We can't give Nebraska a strong defensive effort there, because Michigan State's offense is borderline disastrous, for the record. But I do agree with what you're saying.
But Nebraska made plays, and that's something that their defense, hasn't done. So they got a strip sack fumble in Michigan State territory last week that set up the game tying fumble, and then they ended up winning it on, a true freshman kicker's foot. It's a different Nebraska, and you can see that week in and week out, and that culture is continuing to grow. And you talk about how this is going to develop into a rivalry. I think for it to do that, the games have to start meaning something. And the trajectory is there for Nebraska to say, we're going to build on the end of this season, hopefully with another win against Iowa. And next season, with how the Big Ten West is shaping up, there's no reason that these two teams can't be, competing for the West Division, and the final game of the season decides who wins it. So I think there is a trajectory for this to be on that rivalry that you're talking about.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point. I'm really excited for next season. I think a lot of fans are frustrated with how Iowa's played this season, and I am too, and rightfully so, right? They've very well been in every single game. We could be looking at a team that is, 9-2, 10-1, something along those lines. Yet here we are. They are 7-4. They're playing really just to maybe go 9-4 this season, maybe finish the season ranked in the top 25 or something along those lines, but a borderline top 25 team. They have the talent to be a top 10, a top 15 team. And that's not saying they can compete with Alabama by any means, but Iowa does have the talent to be in one of those upper echelon tiers this year. But the one nice thing is, I think if you listen to our episode last week, we touched on, I believe, the Thursday episode. We talked about the 2019 Hawkeyes and what they bring to the table. The Iowa offense is only losing 3 starters guaranteed at this point. It sounds like Noah Fant is undecided on whether or not he wants to return, which is honestly shocking to me that he hasn't just made the decision to leave, considering how terrible Iowa uses him. But there's a lot of offensive talent returning, especially if Nate Stanley comes back, hopefully progresses again under Brian Ferentz. And then on the defensive side, the Hawks are losing 3 seniors on the defensive line, potentially Anthony Nelson if he decides to go pro. And then they're also losing Jake Gervais as a safety, but he's kind of been up and down throughout the lineup. So there's a lot of talent returning for this team, and it sets up pretty well. It'd be an awesome game to see the last game of the season decide the Big Ten West. I would, that would be, I mean, even like losing that would be really frustrating, but just playing that game would be fantastic. And it'd bring a lot of, competitive vibes to that series, as you mentioned, and kind of more along the lines of like the Michigan-Ohio State game, where every year that's been deciding the Big Ten East every single year. So definitely something to look forward to over the next couple seasons, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, as a Nebraska fan, I think that's one of the things that I miss the most is having a game late in the season that actually matters. So you talked a little bit about how Nebraska's been, hyped up in some of these seasons, and we've seen that happen mostly under Bo Pelini. I think under Mike Riley, people figured out Nebraska's really not very good. But I mean, we would start the season ranked in the top 15, and then play a team like Wisconsin, get blown out, and the season falls apart. So. Yeah, I'm excited to see what the Huskers do in 2019 as well, and hopefully it's going to get to the point where maybe both these teams can start playing those games that matter late in the season rather than continuing to be a little bit disappointing.
Absolutely. And before I do want to jump on some of that piece, I want to talk to you about Adrian Martinez and some of the promising prospects that Nebraska has and what that kind of means for the program going forward. But before we jump into that, Ryan, have you ever heard of Sling TV?
Yeah.
Do you use it by chance?
I do not.
That is unfortunate, but don't worry. For you, we have a fantastic offer that you can use today. And for all of you listeners out there, we have a fantastic offer for you. Because if you're like me, you hate to miss your favorite team play, regardless of who they are playing. For you, Ryan, you live in Wisconsin. Nebraska may not always be on TV, but with Sling TV, you can get them on your TV anywhere, anytime. So that's where Sling TV comes in. Now, we never have to miss a football or a basketball game. It sounds like Nebraska may be good this year. And the best part is we no longer have to pay for a bunch of channels we don't even want to watch with a typical cable package. You and I both know how this goes. We've had cable in the past. We've been roommates. We don't really use a lot of the channels. We pretty much just want to watch sports. And I know you kind of, dabble with some other packages, but Sling TV is fantastic because for just $30 a month, you can get access to ESPN, the Big Ten Network, and more without the hassle of a long-term contract, which, Ryan, I know you hate long-term commitments, so that's perfect for you. And what's even more exciting is that we have a fantastic offer for you. Locked On listeners can get a free 7-day trial by going to sling.com/lockedon. That's SLING.com/lockedon. Never miss a game again with Sling TV. All right. So jumping up, we kind of talked a little bit about the rivalry, the history of kind of Iowa and Nebraska. I wanted to jump a little bit more into what Nebraska brings to the table against Iowa. For those of you who kind of follow the Big Ten or even just kind of, just listening to kind of what's going on, one of the big factors in Nebraska's, offensive resurgence, in my opinion, has been the progression of Adrian Martinez, a freshman quarterback. He is going to be a star in the Big Ten, someone that I am pretty concerned about having to play over the next couple of years. Just when Trace McSorley is getting ready to leave, potentially Dwayne Haskins is kind of budding, but he may be leaving. You get Adrian Martinez, right? So it just never freaking ends in the Big Ten, where you have this one or two players who start as a freshman and they just sit there for 4 or 5 years, and you got to deal with them every single season. That's kind of how I feel Adrian Martinez is going to be for most Big Ten teams. I wanted to get your thoughts on him, how he's progressing over the course of the season, and what you see for his future as a Nebraska starting quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, he's exciting. I think from a Nebraska quarterback standpoint, it's probably the most exciting, guy that we've seen come in and play the position at a high level. And I mean, I don't want to put too much pressure on him, but he's the most excited I've been about a quarterback since Eric Crouch.
You can't even call Eric Crouch a quarterback. He's more of like a glorified running back.
He's a Heisman Trophy winning quarterback, but
a Heisman Trophy winning running back.
Well, we can talk about how many Heisman Trophy winners Iowa has later. But as far as Adrian Martinez, he can do everything, and I think that's what's exciting. And you talk about progression. I think early in the season, he had a really good start against Colorado in the first game of the year. Got hurt in that game, didn't play against Troy, and then came back against Michigan and really struggled. Michigan's defense is obviously great, but you could tell he was a little bit hesitant with what he was doing out there, wasn't getting the ball out quickly enough. But at this point now, he's making better decisions. He's taking what the defense gives him, running the ball when he needs to, taking the quick read if it's there, if not, tucking it down and pulling it and running it. And I mean, even last week against Michigan State, he didn't put up the greatest numbers. The weather was a contributing factor there, but he didn't make mistakes other than putting the ball on the ground from a fumbling standpoint, and that's a whole other issue for Nebraska. But he's not forcing the issue anymore. And, he has arm talent. He has speed. He's figuring out what to do in different situations. And I think, this year you've seen a natural progression of a really talented kid that's going to hopefully be at Nebraska for the next 3 years as well. And I think you're right to be a little bit nervous about what he can do when he gets another year, another offseason under his belt.
Yeah, especially working with Scott Frost. I'm very concerned by it. I mean, we've talked about this a lot, but holy crap. It was fun to hate on Nebraska earlier this season. It was fun to make fun of them. I thoroughly enjoyed it. But in the back of my mind, I always knew at some point they were going to turn it around. I didn't think it would be this season. I was hoping it kind of went into next season for a little bit. And then like at the end of next season, they were like, oh, we can be good. But unfortunately, they're starting to get to that point now where I'm already worried about next year. And kind of touching on Adrian Martinez, he has some really great playmakers with him on the offensive side of the ball. It looks like they have two seniors who are probably obviously going to be gone after this season, but wanted to get your thoughts on playmakers against Iowa this year and playmakers kind of to look out for in the future. Because when you look at the Big Ten conference statistics, Devine Ozigbo, I might have butchered that name, is currently Ozigbo. Okay, he's fifth in the Big Ten with 1,032 rushing yards. Stanley Morgan Jr. has 923 receiving yards, and J.D. Spielman has 818. That is good for third and fourth in the Big Ten in receiving yards. Obviously, Stanley and Devine are seniors. Wanted to get your thoughts on what they bring to the game. What should be, what Iowa should be wary about, considering against Purdue, they allowed a relatively unknown Tyler Wright to catch 3 touchdown passes on them. So there's some weaknesses in that Iowa secondary. What can Stanley Morgan Jr. and J.D. Spielman exploit? And also, do you think Devine Ozigbo can get – I also got that name right, I think, there, so that was fantastic. But what do you think Devine Ozigbo can do in the rushing attack against a pretty stout rush defense at Iowa?
Sure. So I'll start with Stanley Morgan. As far as what he brings to the table, he's one of the more complete receivers I think Iowa's probably going to have seen this season. He's got height, strength, experience. He's quicker than I think people give him credit for, and he's got really good hands. He's a guy that, I see probably going, third or fourth round in the NFL draft, but somebody that can go in somewhere and make an impact right away just because he is a complete receiver. He's been around, and he's kind of the guy that Nebraska's leaned on when they need things to happen this year. Had an opportunity to score last week and was just missed by a Martinez throw. But he's the wide receiver you have to worry about. As far as Ozigbo goes, I mean, he's been Nebraska's rock this season in the backfield. There was kind of a logjam to start the season at running back, and we didn't really know who was going to get minutes, especially with Frost coming in and Ozigbo kind of being a guy with the previous regime. But he's locked down that spot. last week against Michigan State, who has the number one rush defense in the country, he still averaged over 4 yards a carry. And a lot of it is going to be down to, how creative Nebraska gets with the offense against Iowa. And, what's going to come down to the ability to do that is how they exploit the outside. So you talked a little bit about, playmakers to watch out for going forward. There's a true sophomore, J.D. Spielman. He's a receiver, didn't play against Michigan State due to an injury. He's questionable this week, but if he is, if he's able to play, he's another one you have to watch. He's kind of that traditional slot receiver. I think he's about 5'9", 5'10", but extremely quick, fast, pretty good hands as well. And he's one of the guys that Nebraska really looks to get those quick outs and those screens to. And he's a guy that can take it all the way pretty much at any given moment. And then from a running back perspective, the guy that Ozigbo is going to split carries with is going to be Maurice Washington. He's a true freshman. He was a guy that Nebraska got pretty late in the recruiting process. Wasn't sure if he was going to be academically eligible, but he's come in and he's another one that's grown up a little bit this season, I think. If you got a chance to see the Michigan State game last week, he took one of his handoffs out to the left edge and literally just hurdled a guy and cleared him by like 3 feet. So he's an athletic freak. Probably the guy that's the most athletic player on Nebraska's offense. Another one that's, as a true freshman, has some ball security issues, has some decision-making issues, but he's another one that can take it all the way at any given moment. And the fact that Nebraska, who, recently hasn't had those explosive playmakers, now has 2 of those, along with a guy like Stanley Morgan and a solid running back like Ozigbo. I mean, there's plenty of guys that Iowa needs to be worried about this week. And I think that's another thing that's going to benefit Nebraska, going forward is, yeah, we're losing our number one receiver this year in Stanley Morgan, but we have a playmaker to come in and fill his shoes a little bit. And then, if Washington continues to progress, when Ozigbo leaves, there's not much of a hole to fill there either. So I think there's plenty for Iowa to be concerned about this year and, probably for the next couple of years.
Yeah, that really concerns me. The basically what I just heard there is we have a ton of freshmen and sophomore players who are really good, and they're going to be here for a couple of years, while Adrian Martinez also will be here for a couple of years. So that should be super exciting for Iowa football fans everywhere as we get to see them play. A couple of things, you touched on a few things there. One I wanted to make note of is, Devine Ozigbo's emergence this season. The first 3 games, it looks like I have his statistics pulled up. Against Colorado, he averaged 4.3 yards per carry on just 14 carries. Against Troy, he only had 25 yards on 9 carries. And against Michigan, he had 5 yards on 6 carries. Obviously, a very strong defense. Since that game, though, he has had games of 170 yards, 159 yards, 152 yards, and 162 yards. And then obviously the Michigan State rush defense is really good, and he had a 74 yards and a 4.1 yard per carry average. So he's really come on strong as of late, as you kind of mentioned. And Iowa's rush defense is pretty strong. Out of 11 games, they've had 10 really good games. They've held Miles Sanders, they've held Jonathan Taylor, and those type of guys relatively in check. I mean, you can never truly stop a Jonathan Taylor, but you can keep him kind of reeled in and not let him impact the game too much. However, against Northwestern, for the love of God, the Iowa rush defense could not stop what Northwestern was deciding to do in the second half of that game. And really what they were doing was spreading, kind of coming out in a spread attack and then power running the ball, right? Like pulling guards, having multiple people clearing paths, with Isaiah Bowser just running right up the gut every single time. And it was painful to watch. Does Scott Frost incorporate some of those principles into his game planning, or how are they typically handing the ball off to Ozigbo when he's getting his 18 to 20 carries per game?
So it's all going to be out of the shotgun. So Martinez,
that's scary.
Never lines up under center. And Frost uses misdirection, right? So one of the things that they've incorporated more and more as Martinez has gotten more comfortable is they do use the RPOs, so those run pass options. And I think it's you talked about how Northwestern just kind of ran it down Iowa's throat. I wouldn't expect Nebraska to do something similar. I'd expect it to be a little bit more diverse in where they're going with the run. So one of the things that Michigan State did really well last week was handling that misdirection, where Nebraska would, in some cases pull, pretty much everyone to the right and then try and run off the left edge. And Michigan State did a really good job of staying home with that. So I think a lot of what we saw against Michigan State is probably going to be similar to what we see against Iowa from a running standpoint. So Iowa's going to have to be pretty disciplined up front. Otherwise, they're going to struggle with some of that misdirection.
Makes sense. Yeah, it'll be an interesting battle. That is, I mean, when it comes to being disciplined, staying home, staying in your lane, that kind of thing, Iowa does a really good job with that. Where they struggle at is when you have teams like Northwestern who exploit the fact that Iowa likes to stay pretty much in their base package most of the time. So this season, that's either been a standard 4-3 or it's been really a 4-2-5 with Amani Hooker, their kind of Swiss Army knife safety, kind of coming down into the box and playing that run support safety role. And Iowa doesn't like to get out of that. So when you spread them out, they kind of become a much weaker unit because they're not, close together. So it'll be interesting to see how that works. But I think obviously there's some good tape on the Michigan State game. Iowa can watch that, and they do a lot of similar principles to what Michigan State does, and really what a lot of Big Ten teams do, which is something we've talked about before. When it comes to playing a team like Maryland or Illinois, a lot of teams can handle that type of rush offense easier in the Big Ten because a lot of Big Ten defenses are pretty predicated on staying true to what you're doing, staying within your assignment, that kind of thing. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. And as far as the defense goes, though, what can Iowa look to exploit? Right. So we have Nate Stanley, who unfortunately is not a Heisman candidate, as we had talked about earlier in the season. That went downhill super quick. Iowa also has Noah Fant and TJ Hawkinson, two of, I would say, the top 4 tight ends in the nation. They started to, or at least last week, they really made a conceded effort to get the ball to Noah Fant more, which is a little ridiculous that had to be a conceded effort. It should have just been natural because he's arguably one of the best playmakers in the country and will be a top 15 draft pick. So what, from a Nebraska standpoint, scares you in terms of facing Iowa's offense?
A lot. I mean, it's going to start on the ground. I think, Iowa has a couple of running backs that Nebraska's going to struggle with up front. Nebraska's depth on the defensive side of the ball is really not strong either. So we're going to have to rely on the offense to give the defense some breaks. I think 2 guys to probably watch are going to be Mo Berry. He's a linebacker, leads the team in tackles. He's a good player. He's an experienced guy. And then Antonio Reed, he's another senior who had a huge game against Michigan State. Seems like he's really taken on some of the leadership responsibilities on the defensive side. And he's another one that, at times Frost likes to blitz his safeties. So had a couple big plays last week, had a sack, 3 tackles for loss. So I'd expect to see something similar from, an aggression standpoint on the defensive side of the ball. Nebraska's secondary is questionable. Lamar Jackson is their number 1 corner. He's gotten better as the season's progressed, but still hasn't necessarily turned out to be the shutdown guy that Nebraska hoped that he would be. And then, you talked a little bit earlier about a guy like Noah Fant and how maybe he's not being used the right way. Nebraska genuinely doesn't have a guy that can cover Noah Fant. So if you're gonna, spread him out and use him as, maybe more of a slot receiver in this game, that's a matchup that, Iowa should be looking to exploit pretty much the entire time because we don't have the athletes at linebacker outside of maybe Berry that have the ability to cover a guy like Fant.
Yeah, you made a really good point there that I feel like frustrates a lot of Iowa Hawkeye fans is that there's not, I mean, yes, Nebraska does not have the people to cover Noah Fant, but neither do 99% of the teams in the nation. Like, Noah Fant is a physical specimen that can outrun a lot of corners. He's also bigger than most corners and most linebackers. He is a matchup nightmare that Iowa doesn't utilize enough. So as much as it makes sense to say, let's split him out wide and let's attack Nebraska's defense, I would not be surprised to not see that happen, but I sure hope it does. Also, I think I've made this joke before, but I just feel like it's so good, and it's not going to sound good when listeners listen to this, but if only Lamar Jackson was as talented at safety as he is at quarterback, that would be fantastic for Nebraska's defense.
That's a terrible joke. They're completely different people.
It sounded so much better in my head right as I was saying it, and then as I said it, I was like, wow, that's actually even worse than the first time I said it. So anyways, we can keep going. We only have a few minutes left, so I want to wrap it up.
One more thing on defense. I probably should have mentioned this before. I would expect to see a lot of blitzing on third down. So depending on how Stanley plays, and I looked at the weather forecast too, it looks like it's going to be, pretty windy, 10 to 20 mile an hour winds, possibility of rain. If he's not, sure with what he's doing, I would expect to see Nebraska bring a lot of pressure, especially on third down. It's kind of what, Eric Shenander's been doing this year. And against good quarterbacks, it doesn't work that well. Against questionable quarterbacks like we had against Michigan State last week, it does work well. So I think a lot of it's going to come down to how Stanley can handle those conditions.
Yeah, and I think he doesn't handle that kind of stuff super well. He has a lot of talent. There's a lot of stuff you like when you watch Nate Stanley play football, but when he starts getting pressured and hit, I would say the majority of the time it becomes kind of an issue, right? He'll still throw one ball pretty bad, and then the next ball is bad, and then six balls are bad. Against Indiana was probably one of the few times I saw him take that pressure and kind of flip the script. He was able to evade some of the defenders. He was able to throw some of them off and kind of do some Ben Roethlisberger-esque type of things. But in general, throughout the season, when he's getting a lot of pressure, he's kind of struggled to handle that. And not necessarily just on him, but Iowa's offensive line has been, I would honestly say, one of their weaker spots this year, especially on the tackles. They have two sophomore tackles who are good, are going to be talented if they can keep developing. But right now, they struggle with a lot of things. That's Alaric Jackson and Tristan Wirfs. They struggle with penalties. They struggle with allowing elite edge rushers or blitzing teams to get off the edge and attack Nate Stanley, and they haven't been able to pick that up. So that'll be a good battle to watch and something that obviously I hope Iowa can hold the advantage in, and they can keep Nate Stanley clean. When they keep him clean, he does pretty well. He can go through his reads and progressions, but as soon as he starts getting hit, he starts to struggle with some of those basic things that you expect to see. And we're close to time, so I wanted to, before we wrap up the show, I wanted to cover kind of the betting odds for this, right? So oddly enough, Iowa is favored by 10 points, and I can see where Vegas came in on that, right? Iowa is obviously the better team in terms of record. I would say even at this point, they are the more talented team. I think Nebraska is definitely on the up and up, and Scott Frost is a fantastic coach. And as we've talked about throughout this show, there's a good opportunity that over the coming years, this could be a really great game, one that potentially decides the Big Ten West. But Iowa, I would say, is a more talented team. They have a better matchup against Nebraska, and they're playing at home. So that's always in Iowa's favor to play at Kinnick. But being favored by 10 points against a Nebraska team that is doing pretty well over the last 5 games of the season. Their only loss to Ohio State, and that was even a pretty close loss. They were, performing pretty well throughout that game. So wanted to get your take. What is your prediction? What is your prediction for the game? And also, what if you were a betting man, and I know you are, and we'll probably put a bet on this game, which we should actually decide on the show. What would you pick for this game?
So I think Iowa probably will win the game. I think it's maybe one step too far for Nebraska to go to Iowa on senior day and try and pull this out. I think 10 points is a lot of points, though. And I think Nebraska's shown that they have enough character to, if they go down a couple scores, they're going to keep fighting back. So if I was going to bet on the game, which I will not be, I would probably take Nebraska to cover the 10, but I think Iowa's probably going to win the game.
That's fair. I would agree with that. I also think I'm going to take a look at the over-under quick because I'm very curious to see what they have this as. It looks like the over-under is 53, and in that aspect, I would absolutely take the over. I think Adrian Martinez presents a matchup nightmare for the Hawks. He is a good, versatile, athletic quarterback, and not that Iowa has struggled with that. Their line does a pretty good job of containing. They have a very athletic and tall defensive line, and they have a 2-deep rotation that allows their linemen to stay pretty fresh throughout. But all it takes is 1 or 2 plays that Adrian Martinez can break the defensive line containment, and that will put Iowa kind of on its heels throughout the rest of the game. So I do think this might be a kind of a high-scoring game. I do agree that Iowa will win, and I also agree that I don't think they're going to win by more than 10. However, I do want to make a bet with you because it makes this game so much better when I win money from you. And I've already lost a ton of bets with you this year on our different stupid bets. But what would you give me for the actual spread to bet against? We're not going to do the Vegas spread. I want to see what you say for points. What points will you give me for Iowa to win?
For Iowa to win?
Yep.
For me to take a bet, I would probably have to get 13.
Oh, should have just kept the Vegas odds. All right, I will bet you $20 Iowa wins by 11.
Let's go with beers instead of money.
All right, let's do 3 beers. Iowa wins by 11.
All right, I'll do it.
Deal. Awesome. Well, that is a great way to wrap up the show. We both agree that Iowa will probably win. Obviously, there's some dissent on what they will win by. And even though I said I don't think Iowa will win by 10, I just really like winning from Ryan. So I'm willing to risk beer for that. And anyways, I will likely buy him beer anyways because I owe him a lot from previous bets. And I'll be seeing him in a couple weeks. So that is all for our show. Ryan, thank you for jumping on. Any last minute words you would like to say about the Nebraska-Iowa matchup before we close the show?
No, I think we covered most of it. Thanks for having me on this morning.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all Locked On Hawkeyes listeners for jumping on. Our next episode will be coming out after Thanksgiving. So we're only going to be having 2 episodes this week. It's a little bit shorter week with Thanksgiving. We hope you have a fantastic holidays. Enjoy your time with your family. Eat lots of turkey. Watch lots of football. Obviously, hope the Hawks win on Friday as we expect them to. And we'll be back on Monday morning giving you a recap of the game along with a lot of other exciting content pieces. And we'll be back hopefully with even 5 episodes. And we may have a surprise guest. One of Iowa's top receivers in the Kirk Ferentz era will be joining our show to talk about his time as an Iowa Hawkeye. And we'll kind of leave some spoilers as we go on. I want to create the hype for that. So definitely something to be looking forward to. And that'll do it for our morning episode. As I said, I am your host, Andrew Wade, and you can find me on Twitter at Wade_Andrew. And you can follow all of the exciting happenings of the Locked On Hawkeyes podcast on Twitter at Locked On Iowa. Also, make sure you subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. And please leave us a review of what you think of the show. Thank you again for joining us on the Locked On Hawkeyes podcast. Have a fantastic day, Hawkeye Nation, and we'll be back next week.